More than 100 world leaders to gather online for a democracy summit. The US-led campaign has attracted controversy even before it begins. Well, let's stay on that summit, and for that, Andrew Yeo joins us. He is a visiting fellow at Brookings Institute's Centre for East Asia Policy. Andrew, critics are saying that Biden's misguided in prioritizing a democracy summit right now over other pressing issues like COVID, for example. You agree?
Sure. Well, yes, there certainly are pressing issues. We have climate change, we have the pandemic, but we have to remember that during the election campaign, President Biden had repeatedly pledged to restore democracy at home and strengthen it abroad. The Summit for Democracy can be seen as a first of likely many steps in fulfilling that pledge. And yes, there were detractors who thought the timing might be too early, especially with the ongoing pandemic and the inability of leaders to travel in person. But scheduling the summit during Biden's first year in office sends an important message to U.S. allies as well as its adversaries that strengthening global democracy is a high priority for the administration.
Andrew, in the lead up to this online summit, the United States had said, look, we're not a perfect democracy either, but how well placed is the United States in spearheading these global democratic efforts?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. The United States is far from being a perfect democracy, as we witnessed during the Trump era and culminating in the January 6th riots at the U.S. Capitol. But many global rights activists around the world still look to the U.S. for political and moral support when it comes to defending human rights and democracy because of its outsized influence. Global democracy can't be supported by just the U.S. or any single country alone. But on the flip side, I think the task of promoting the global democracy agenda faces far greater hurdles in the absence of the United States. So I still think that the U.S. is really well placed to spearhead this democratic effort.
Andrew, how would you describe Biden's brand of democracy or what his administration's doing differently?
Yeah, so the biggest difference with past recent efforts at democracy promotion is the Biden administration's emphasis on multilateralism or taking a multilateral approach to this summit and just the democracy promotion agenda. There's been a tendency to equate U.S.-led democracy promotion and nation building with American unilateralism, particularly in the Middle East. And this was true to some extent during the Clinton era as the U.S. ramped up support for global democracy after the end of the Cold War. But the Iraq War under the George W. Bush administration eventually made some Americans really averse to democracy promotion as it became equated with forceful regime change. But in contrast, the Biden administration is making an early effort to consult with allies and partners. So I think that's one of the key differences this time around.
There's been a lot of talk, Andrew, about who's on the invite list, who's attending that summit over the next couple of days. But one notable exclusion is China, of course, and Beijing has since released its own democracy white paper. Do you think that this summit in some way could backfire and perhaps even reinforce divisions globally instead?
Yeah, so just first on the note about China being absent and coming out with its own democracy white paper, there are many different and even competing definitions of democracy, but China's framing of democracy is a bit farcical. But that said, the Summit for Democracy that it might create an us versus them or a democracy versus autocracy dichotomy and thus reinforce divisions is a legitimate concern. And the Biden administration has always been aware of that framing. And so it's invited several countries which might not exactly qualify as democracies. And it's also included issues that non-democratic regimes might aspire towards, particularly in the areas of governance and anti-corruption. So the Biden administration, I think, has tried to make the summit less about China and instead highlight how allies and partners can strengthen measures for accountability, open governance, and respect for the rule of law and fundamental rights. And this is something that would be of interest to even non-democratic regimes.
It has been said that the summit is trying to move the needle of democracy. How do we judge? How do we assess if they've succeeded. What's the potential for any realistic change to come out of this?
Yeah, so we all know that democracy is an ideal, or it's a principle. So we're always going to be trying to improve and strengthen democracy at home and abroad. But democracy improves. The steps are incremental, and so as I mentioned before, the summit is really the first step that the Biden administration is taking to try to strengthen global democracy after seeing a democratic recession around the globe. And there's a lot of hard work ahead. So one thing that the administration has done is it's planned a year's worth of working group meetings involving government officials and NGOs to check in on progress and to periodically meet with other leaders, other country officials to see if they're making progress. So it's not just a one-off summit, but the hope is to continue the conversation and keep each other accountable on the democracy front.
Thank you. We appreciate your thoughts there. Andrew Yeo, visiting fellow at Brookings Institute Center for East Asia Policy Studies.